Welcome to Season 6 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Savannah Dodd, and I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. Each week, I'll be talking with an accomplished photographer about the ethics of their practice. This episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast is brought to you by Falmouth University, one of the UK's leading creative arts institutions. If you're a regular listener, you'll know that I'm passionate about education, especially education that is accessible. With flexible online learning through Falmouth University, you can study from anywhere, starting in January, May, or September. Join the university that has nurtured the award-winning photographers Justin Carey, who we interviewed in Season 1, and Rehab El-Dalil, who we interviewed in Season 4. Falmouth graduates have been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, and the BBC. If you're passionate about photography and want to refine your practice, Falmouth's specialist photography courses are designed for you. Led by expert academics and industry-savvy tutors, you'll develop your critical thinking and create work that explores powerful themes on a local, national, and international scale. Search Photography at Falmouth to find out more. Today, in episode number 11, we'll be talking with Tiffany Fairey on visualizing peace. Dr. Tiffany Fairey is a senior research fellow in the Department of War Studies at King's College London. Her research focuses on arts-based peace building, specifically on visual peace and visual peace building methods and practice, and examines how images and image making can shape inclusive peace and dialogue. A leading expert in participatory visual methods and photo voice, she brings over 20 years of global experience working with partners at the intersection of photography, community, and social change. As the founder and former director of the award-winning UK charity Photo Voice, Tiffany played a pioneering role in shaping ethical participatory image-making practices. Her work combines academic rigor with a deep commitment to collaboration and public impact. She's an associate with Everyday Peace Indicators and on the board of the Post-Conflict Research Center. Her contributions have been recognized with various awards, including the Royal Photographic Society's Hood Medal for Outstanding Public Service through Photography and a Leverhulme Fellowship. She's widely published in academic journals, and her books include Peace Photography, A Guide, and the forthcoming monograph, Imaging Peace. Could we start with you just telling us a little bit about the kind of work that you do?
Yeah, so I've had, it's coming up to 25 years or more of a career working mainly really with participatory community photography, principally with Photo Voice. I'm one of the co-founders of the UK organisation Photo Voice. I'm not actually involved with it anymore. But myself and Anna Blackman from about 1999 to 2010 built the organisation. We were undergraduates, young university students when we started it, or just finished university. And by the time we finished, we'd kind of built a really vibrant community of people. We worked with lots of freelance photographers and a great team. Got amazing support from the photography community. Leaving Photo Voice, I went into academia. I did my PhD. Essentially, the PhD was really an opportunity to reflect a bit on the practice of participatory photography. I was very interested in particularly the ethics, thinking about the ethics and the impact of these community photography projects, questions of power, who's benefiting from these projects, how people do or don't benefit, I guess a lot around the politics of visibility. And there wasn't a lot of opportunities while we were building Photo Voice to really stop and reflect because we were so busy doing. I undertook longitudinal research as part of my PhD. What you find often in community and participatory photography is that evaluations are often done immediately after the end of a project or during, and there's been very little longitudinal research. So I focused my research on an amazing project in Peru called TAFOS that ran during the 80s and 90s during the internal conflict there and involved 270 community photographers. And I went and found some of those photographers kind of 20 years after to find out about the significance of the project in their lives. So yeah, really focused on this kind of long-term transformative effect of being involved in community photography initiatives. And then really the last 8 years, I've been based within academia and specifically working as a peace and conflict researcher on different research projects that are looking at the role of the arts in post-conflict processes, specifically thinking of the role of arts and culture within peace building, reconciliation and transitional justice. Most recently, the last 4 years, I've had a Leverhulme Fellowship and I've been working on a project called Imaging Peace, which is specifically looking at the role that photography, by photography I mean images and image making, the role that photography has in the building of peace and dialogue after conflict, war and mass violence, and also in contexts of entrenched division and polarization. So there really now, I guess my focus was very much on this idea of visual peace, what forms of visual peace building might consist of, but specifically within the context of localized image making and community and participatory forms of image making.
That's all really interesting. And I've got lots of questions to get into about the peace photography element. But before, I'd just like to understand a little bit more. You said when you started Photo Voice, you were just out of undergrad. So where was your background in undergrad? Were you a photographer prior to this? Like, I'm an anthropologist, and I feel like that's all very aligned with a lot of the things that you're describing as well. What was your background that sort of led you into this route?
Yeah, so I think like lots of people, I discovered photography. When I say lots of people, people who love photography, I discovered it as a teenager, and I did photography GCSE and A-level. I discovered the darkroom. I spent hours in it. I feel like I almost got to know and understand the world through images. You know, I kind of spent hours looking at photo books and everything, and I thought I wanted to be a photographer. I did a foundation in photography straight out of school. And then, as many people do, I went traveling and thought, okay, this is it, you know, going off to see the world, take my camera. I had one of those kind of moments. I was in Thailand, you know, on the kind of backpackers circuit. We were trekking. We were in some, you know, a hill village, and there's just a group of tourists who were just shoving their cameras in the face of all these women. And it was one of those real like, ooh, maybe I don't want to do this. I felt really uncomfortable, I guess, about this idea of who's taking the pictures and who's telling the story. That idea that taking photos of someone is almost like putting words into their mouth. I guess I had issues with it. I also, when I did my photography foundation, went and documented a circus over a few months. And again, in that position, that being the kind of role of the documenter, I felt uncomfortable. I was like, I don't know what it's like to live in a circus. I guess I started problematizing it a lot. My undergraduate was in social anthropology, and I was at Edinburgh, and you have a 4-year course there. And in your 3rd year, you get to go off and do field work. I had seen an exhibition in London of a project. It was originally called Out of the Dump. It's now called Photo Kids. It's an amazing project that was set up by a Reuters photographer called Nancy McGeer. She had been photographing on the rubbish dump in Guatemala City and had ended up running photography classes for kids who were living on the dump. That was my second light bulb moment when I saw that exhibition in London. I was just like, oh, wait a minute, this is a whole different way of using photography. I can still work with photography, create pictures, but do it in conjunction with people rather than as a kind of solo enterprise. So I wrote off to her and said, can I come and work on your project? And she wrote back and kind of went, I'm not sure. And I met her years later, and she explained why. She was worried about me being too young and possibly a bit naive. But what I did end up doing was going and working in refugee camps in the south of Nepal with people who had fled from Bhutan. I spent 6 months in those camps, working with young people, teaching photography. They started a newspaper. We did a lot of art workshops. And actually that project became one of the 2 founding projects of Photo Voice. When I came back from that experience, I started talking to other friends of mine on the course, and Anna Blackman, who I co-founded Photo Voice with, she had been in Vietnam doing a similar kind of project with street children. We realized we had done something very similar, and we had a joint exhibition of the images. We went off, freshly graduated, to Perpignan as both as photography lovers. We went to Visa pour l'Image, you know, the big photojournalism festival. I guess we just sat there kind of going, there's only one type of image here. Like the images that have come out, the projects that we've been working on, Anna had been working with street children, I had been working with young refugees. And the photography that had come out of those projects, we were so blown away by the stories that were being told. I think we just felt that there was a real need for more different kinds of image making to be represented in those kind of forums. And in that kind of way that you do over a beer, have a brilliant idea. And we were like, let's do it. Let's set up an organisation that tries to find more of a platform for community-generated image making, participatory photography projects. So that's where Photo Voice was born, and we were literally straight out of uni and had amazing support from the photography community and were able to build the organisation. By the time we both left, it was a kind of team of 7. We had done, 40, 50, 60 different projects all over the world in partnership with NGOs and community groups, running all sorts of participatory photography projects in the UK and overseas.
Well, that's really interesting and really helpful to sort of understand a little bit more about your background. I do think sometimes a question that I hear among photographers when it comes to maybe more participatory methods or photo voice methods is sort of, well, what's the role of the photographer in these spaces? And I guess I wonder, how would you answer that?
Well, I see it very clearly. The photographer is there as a kind of mentor, guide and support. The difference is the photographer is there to facilitate other people's photography, not their own. I guess for me, the role's always been straightforward because I never really had a career as a photographer. All my professional life, I've been much more in that role of supporting and working with others to show their photography or to find a platform. I was always much more interested in the way other people took images than my own. That's always what has excited me and interested me. I have also very much come to the conclusion that not all photographers are suited to this kind of form or this way of doing photography, because it does very much require you to push beyond how you see things and really, I guess, listen and concentrate on and think about how others can use photography, not just to see things and to express things or to tell stories, but also often in these projects, a lot of the kind of benefits and outcomes aren't really anything to do with the images. When I'm talking to other participatory photography practitioners, this is the expression they use, is it's so much more than photography. So for photographers, it's not necessarily going to be a way of working that they kind of enjoy or comes naturally to them, because it is very much, really about facilitating something beyond the photography, but also facilitating through and via photography rather than really creating your own.
Yeah, and I guess that requires a real letting go of what you want the end product to look like or what you expect the images to look like.
And of assumptions. You have to let go of your assumptions about what you think might be useful or relevant, the stories that should or shouldn't be told, the kinds of images that should be seen. Because, you could be working with a group, there could be some stunning images, and they might decide that they're not the ones they want to show. And also there are opportunities that might come up or places that these images could be seen, but those places or spaces might not be relevant or interesting to the participants. They might not be a priority to the participants. So, you have to kind of let go of quite a lot of assumptions. Control, I guess, is a key thing.
I think that there's a lot in that would be useful for photographers, even if they're not using photo voice methods, that idea of letting go of assumptions and sort of questioning what stories are useful or important for people to tell. Like, that's something that I think is quite useful across the board in photography, generally.
Yeah. I guess the key difference, a photographer is almost imposing a particular perspective on a story or a community and whatever they're documenting. And that's a key skill, like they're helping the viewer to see something. But in supporting other people's photography or in participatory photography practice, you're helping other people realize their vision. You can't impose your perspective or view or version of what the images should or shouldn't be. So it's a very different kind of, not just skill set, but a different way of working with photography, quite distinct. And there are many photographers that can do the both. I see brilliant photographers who do amazing work with communities, but there are also photographers that aren't so great at it, because their real skill is, they've got a particular way of seeing the world, and that's a kind of incredible talent in and of itself, but it precludes them being able to support others.
I think that's a really helpful distinction. And I think also, I really appreciate the way that you framed that as well, as demonstrating that there's value in both perspectives and each can give something different. And I think that's really useful to think about, the different ways of saying and how those can shed different types of light on different issues. Does that resonate?
Yeah, definitely. I think one thing that I have constantly been trying to push back against in relation to this question of participatory photography alongside professional photography or whatever is that there's somehow a kind of competition between the two, or that there's a binary between the two. Because in the end, I guess what's important is the plurality of voice and a plurality of different ways of seeing, and both are very important. And I guess, as we might come to talking more about this idea of peace photography, it's the same with peace photography. It's not like peace photography is against war photography and we must have one or the other. I think there's a danger sometimes in photography that we have to think in terms of binaries or in terms of hierarchies, like someone's way of seeing is more authentic or more important or more valuable than others. So we could talk about insider versus outsider photography. And it's just really not very helpful because actually, an outsider coming into community can really reveal new things to that community and to others because they're seeing it through different eyes. But also, there is such an important role for insider-led photography. And this is where I see participatory and community photography as playing such a key component of photography. But it is a component that is often, I guess, kind of marginalised, or it's kind of often on the periphery. It's not taken as seriously. And I guess that's where, I get more of a kind of advocacy hat on, because I feel really strongly that participatory forms and community forms of photography play a kind of vital role in terms of surfacing plural ways of vision, and also in terms of enabling us to see the world and issues and stories differently through different lenses and in more nuanced, complex ways. So yeah, in that sense, that's very much where my kind of career and I guess practice or my work has stood, but it doesn't mean that I see that as in opposition to anything else. It's more just that they're part of different ways of using and seeing and working with photography.
No, I think that that's really helpful. And you mentioned a little bit earlier on about, the different ethics of participatory or community photography projects that you focused on for your PhD research. And I wonder if you could maybe just elaborate on that a little bit, like what kinds of ethical challenges often come up in these types of projects?
Yeah, so when we were, PhotoVoice was growing and we were working on all these different projects, really amazing projects. We had fantastic partners over the years, and we were often doing kind of what I would say iterative projects, so multiple projects with the same group over a number of years. And we would see so many of the same ethical challenges and issues arise. And, now there's a lot more conversation around these issues. There's a lot more in the public discourse. There's a whole field now around ideas of dignified storytelling or kind of narrative ethics, things like that really, really didn't exist when we first started PhotoVoice. Or it existed, but it wasn't easy to access, basically, as a young practitioner. Actually, we at PhotoVoice, over a couple of years, in conjunction with a photographer, an artist called Liz Orton, we decided to try and capture some of these kind of ethical issues that we were dealing with. And we produced, I think we were the first organisation to do it, or one of the first, an ethical statement of practice to try to capture the kind of, I guess, not different categories, but different dimensions of ethics. And that document still exists, and I think PhotoVoice still uses it and it's very accessible. But we first published that in 2007, and we went through quite a long process to do it. We spoke to a lot of people, the way these kind of statements need to be drilled down and distilled into various pillars. Actually, I don't know if I've still got them clearly in my head, but so much of the ethical issues we were dealing with were around the politics of visibility. Many of the communities we were working with were often vulnerable or marginalised politically or economically, But this politics of visibility and how these projects enabled these communities, these people to become visible, and the complications with that. Because I think there's a complex power dynamic that goes on in these projects. And often participatory ways or collaborative ways of working are often seen as a bit of a magic bullet in a way to kind of bypass some of these ethical challenges and to kind of make more ethical images, I guess, or more authentic images. But actually we found the more we got into this work, the more and more complicated it became. So, for example, over about 8 to 10 years, we worked a lot with unaccompanied youth who came to London as refugees. I realised there that young people approached the projects differently. Some wanted to be visible and talk openly about their experiences as young refugees, and some didn't. Some were coming to these photography projects as a way to find a kind of safe space, to make new memories, but very much within their own circles. You know, this is not something they wanted to be public about. But then others felt really strongly about speaking out to a public audience about what it meant to be a young refugee. But there was this real diversity even with the same group. So you couldn't make any assumptions about how people wanted to use their photography. But that also brought up dilemmas when we did do exhibitions and things. I think I was quite naive. We learned a lot on the job, so to say. So, you know, sometimes we'd be inviting journalists to exhibitions and we'd find their line of questioning or the way they represented the work wasn't always appropriate, or they didn't treat the young people right. So we learned quickly that actually it wasn't just as simple as providing a platform and supporting these young people to show their pictures and stories to the world. There was actually a more active role that we had to take in, I guess, acting as a bridge, but also in protecting as well the young people that we worked with. Another example is a young Bhutanese refugee that I worked with took a whole series of images that he really wanted published. But I was kind of concerned because of the content and the story they told, the ramifications about having those images out in the public would have for him and his family in terms of their potential for repatriation. And it felt really wrong for me to be taking that decision, you know, and I consulted lots of people. And in the end, we talked a lot with that young person, talked through, and he was really insistent that he wanted his picture seen. This is why I'm doing the project. But actually, in the end, he did make the decision not to publish. The politics of visibility basically can not be straightforward. When you're working with groups that are traditionally silenced, suddenly becoming visible and having their stories heard is complicated as well, because a lot of the times they're not listened to as well. So there's dangers of raising expectations that can't be met through these projects. We've had complications around finances as well, because at Photo Voice we always felt very strongly that any profits made from images, that money would be going back directly to the photographers. But then we also found in some projects, some photographers would be generating more income than others because some images were just more, I guess, palatable or more, you know, commercial. More people wanted to buy them, and that would create all sorts of tensions and inequalities in the project itself. So we rapidly realised that ethics was specific, context specific. There were no hard set rules, that it was complicated, basically, and that everything had to be understood on an individual perspective, but that there were also these kind of overarching themes and things that we were seeing and tackling that were coming up repeatedly. We did think about that, but there often wasn't the time to really be able to reflect, which is really what pushed me into taking time over the PhD research to do that. At Photo Voice, we had to advocate a lot for this kind of work, fundraise for it, which by the nature of the beast means distilling and kind of trying to sell the work. And that doesn't often leave a lot of space for a kind of reflexive practice that allows you to think critically and talk critically about the work. So that's really why I undertook the PhD.
No, that's very interesting. And I also really appreciated, you know, what you were saying about Photo Voice creating that ethical statement of practice, because that's something that we really advocate for at the Photography Ethics Center as well, is to try to encourage photographers and organizations using photography to write a statement of ethics, to really take that time, because I think you're completely right. You know, when you're in the throes of the day-to-day work, it's very difficult to step back and take time to think about, you know, where do we sit on this ethically and how do we make ethical decisions and what are those principles that guide our practice. That's definitely something that is very parallel with the type of thing that we're advocating at the center. Could you tell us a little bit about your most recent piece of research then that you have been working on with regard to peace photography?
Yes, of course. So the research project itself is called Imaging Peace, and it's a multi-country study of localized forms of peace photography. Peace photography, it doesn't necessarily exist currently as a genre, or I would say it's an emerging genre, but in the sense that we know what war photography is, and war photography is a long-established genre. It's much studied, much celebrated, it's much considered. But there's been very little thought given to what a photography of peace might consist of. So if we draw on existing peace theory, there's this idea of both negative and positive forms of peace. This comes from a kind of founding father of peace theory. He's called Galtang. He talks about how negative peace is when peace is understood as just simply the cessation of violence. So, war has ended, we have peace. Positive forms of peace is when we understand peace in a much more expansive way, as incorporating all sorts of, social justice, tackling of structural violence. It's not just the direct end of direct forms of violence. When we think about photography and images of peace, so often peace is represented only in its negative form. So if you think of images that are linked to articles around, let's say peace in a particular country, you'll often have images that depict that peace through the prism of war. So it might be in the aftermath of destroyed buildings or the faces of people who have been harmed by war, or it might be in images of politicians shaking hands over a peace deal, that immediate, we've got a deal. But there's very little, I guess, in the images that tells a wider story about what it actually takes and means to build and sustain peace. The research is really concerned, I guess, with the limited visual vocabulary that we have for peace. And it's coming from that starting point, but also being, as I say, a long-term practitioner and researcher of participatory and community forms of photography, I was really aware that there was lots of different forms of image making that were representing peace differently or showing all sorts of forms of community resilience or resistance, forms of everyday peace that just weren't necessarily seen in visual discourses around war and peace. And so this idea of peace photography is really trying to reframe how we might think about how images and image making can be used to support peace, reconciliation, and transitional justice. And with my research, what I've done is looked at existing projects, forms of participatory and community collaborative photography that are operating as what might be interpreted as forms of peace photography. So these projects don't necessarily themselves identify as peace photography projects. Me as a researcher, I'm very much going in and trying to understand what they're doing in terms of how it's directly impacting and supporting peace processes. I've built case studies of more than 30 different localized photography initiatives. And I'm really trying to build a picture of what the ethics and dynamics of those initiatives consist of and really how they operate as forms of visual peace building, not only in terms of the images that they produce, but in terms of how photography is used more broadly, photography and image making, to build community dialogues, to rebuild relations, to support healing. So in the portfolio of lots of different projects that I've looked at, there's forms of therapeutic photography, there's forms of participatory photography or more traditional photo voice projects, but there's also Indigenous photography collectives and forms of counter archives. So there's lots of different forms of image making represented. And then, of course, in a couple of the projects that I've been engaged with, I've been actively involved myself as a researcher, working with and supporting communities to deliver these kind of initiatives. So as part of this research, we've created a website that's showcasing lots of the different case studies and contributors to the research. But we've also produced something called the Peace Photography Guide, which is essentially a practitioner's resource that is talking about this concept and idea of what peace photography is. And it's also sharing what I've identified as kind of photography's peace capacities. So different ways that photography can work to foster imaginaries of peace and peaceful cultures, how it can be used to build community in the aftermath of conflict or in contexts where people are dealing with legacies of mass violence or are resisting ongoing violence or conflict. And the idea of the resource really is to share some of the learning I've gathered from talking to all of these practitioners and really put it out into the world as a provocation so other practitioners can start trying to think about how they might work with this idea of peace photography. The resource, which is co-authored with Ingrid Guyon as well, who's a photographer and participatory photographer practitioner, is full of lots of activities. So it's got projects and exercise ideas, as well as lots of information around what an ethics of peace photography might consist of, as well as showcasing, just having project case studies. So that's in the resource and in the website. And yes, the resource is free and downloadable as a PDF, and we've got it translated into 3 languages as well. So we're really trying to make it accessible as possible to practitioners in lots of different countries. And we hope to do a printed version as well.
Absolutely. I mean, if you had to pick maybe 1 or 2 key recommendations from the guidance for practitioners, could you maybe pick a couple and elaborate on them for us?
In the context of peace photography, and when we're thinking about ethics, I guess the key thing really in post-conflict settings is ethics in terms of security and protection, and ensuring that you as a practitioner or you as an organizer of a project or when you're working in conjunction with communities are really thinking through and I guess preempting how to do no harm or minimize harm. In peace and conflict studies, I mean, this idea of do no harm photography has been around, this idea that we must always think carefully through about what the ramifications of these projects could be for all those involved, what the ramifications for communities and participants for having their images out in the world could entail. For example, with other peace and conflict scholars who have used visual methods, there's sometimes a very conscious choice to never, ever publish the images that come out of these projects because of the potential issues around security, identity, participants being identifiable, the ramifications for participants for having those images out in the world long term. And that's often an active choice. And I would say within peace photography, that is one of the kind of key considerations. Are these images to be shared or not? There shouldn't be an assumption that these projects are always about sharing these images. So yes, this question around security, protection and anonymity, in terms of a kind of concrete recommendation, I really push back about being able to give those, because the whole way that I understand ethics anyway is that there aren't set do's and don'ts. So we've been very careful, Ingrid and I, when preparing and formulating and writing this resource, to not give a set of do's and don'ts, but really raise the issues that people need to think about. And I was just going to say before, within the peace building community, there's a recognition that do no harm isn't actually always the most appropriate framework or way to think through these issues, because actually there's always a potential for harm when you intervene and get involved and work with others. And they use this framework, this idea of minimizing harm. So that's one of the things that we talk about in the guide. Like when you work with people and alongside people using photography, it is ultimately an intervention, and there is always the potential for harm because you can never predict how images are going to be used, how participants want to use their photography, where those images are going to go, how they're going to be received by audiences. It's just really hard to know. So it's a case of kind of really trying to think through at every stage with your partners, with participants, this kind of constant reflective process to think about the ramifications. It's this idea of the politics of visibility, what those could be for participants and the partners and everyone involved in the project.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you said as well about, avoiding the do's and don'ts, that is also very in line with the approach that we take at the Photography Ethics Center to ethics as well, which is avoiding offering guidelines and instead promoting, like you said, these considerations and things to encourage people to think about. And I guess the other thing that sort of strikes me is that when it comes to conflict, that's something that's very visual and very potentially easier to photograph than peace. And I guess I wonder, especially in contexts where, there is no resolution as yet, how have participants visually represented like a desired future for peace that doesn't yet exist?
Yeah, that's such a great question in the sense that, a lot of peace theorists talk about peace as potentiality. It's so often in post-conflict settings, peace isn't a reality for communities. Besides any ongoing violence, there can be very entrenched forms of division and all sorts of reasons and factors why peace is really not a day-to-day reality for communities. And I think this is where photography is, why it's such a brilliant tool. Photography isn't always about photographing what's there. It's also about projecting, isn't it? With photographs, we see the present, or we see what's in front of us through a past, but it's also about projecting into a future. And this kind of circularity of time is so fundamental to kind of building peace and often to how communities directly affected by conflict and violence are kind of seeing and understanding and working towards, as active agents working towards peace themselves. And photography allows for that layering. I've seen in projects, there's this incredible way that participants kind of are using photography often to, I guess, represent what is, but also what could be, to kind of assert what could be, because they're documenting peaceful cultures or peaceful behaviours or what might be thought of as everyday forms of peace in their community, but also in documenting them and giving them a kind of visual significance. Because, of course, when we photograph something, we're saying this is important. So by photographing them and making them the focus of the image rather than the destruction or the damage that has been done, they're asserting the life that's still there and the life that they're kind of working towards. For example, one of the projects that I've worked on over 4 years is in Colombia with an organisation called Everyday Peace Indicators. And there we worked with 6 different communities. They're rural communities that have been affected by many generations, over decades by the conflict. And Everyday Peace Indicators, what it does is it works with different parts of the community to generate what they call indicators of peace, because often an evaluator would be coming into that community and kind of defining what were the signs or, I guess, milestones that would show that peace exists in that community. Often in traditional peace-building evaluation, those kind of indicators are decided by external experts. And of course, another form of expert is the person with lived experience who really understands what might be signs or indicators of peace within their own community. So what Everyday Peace Indicators does is they work to generate these great big long lists of like what are the signs of peace or justice or coexistence in your community. And then what we did is worked with photo voice groups where community photographers then took photographs, made photo stories of these peace indicators. And what was really interesting that was happening in the photography is, so one of the indicators might have been no illegal crops are being grown in our village or something, which is, of course, referring to the fact that a lot of people in their community get drawn into the cocoa trade and working alongside the armed groups that are often obviously part of the dynamics of violence in their community. And what the photographers did in terms of trying to represent that visually is they went and took photographs of women tending the fields, growing the traditional crops of mango or cassava as a way to kind of assert the alternative. So while the indicator itself had been framed in a kind of negative form, saying there will be no illicit crop, an indicator of peace will be there's no illicit crops grown in our area. What they were doing, the photography is showing, like, look, this is us, these are the crops we can grow. And they created these beautiful, very kind of inspiring images that kind of asserted the presence of alternatives, peaceful alternatives, and also visibilized the people that were pursuing peaceful alternatives. It was almost showing within the community is like, we've got options and there are other dignified ways of making life. One of the challenges with this idea of peace photography you've touched on, which is so key, is, of course, images of war are very compelling. War is visually compelling and visually powerful. And peace, as you say, isn't necessarily that interesting. In fact, peace is quite mundane. But I think what's so exciting is it pushes us, I guess, to find ways and strategies to make the ordinary extraordinary. Because, of course, we all know that even the most ordinary things, whether it's kind of deep friendships or family ties or the people we love, all those things that are part of a peaceful culture are in and of themselves extraordinary. But maybe sometimes as visual practitioners, we're lazy in terms of going for the easy hits. So in that sense, there will always be all these iconic images of war. And it's in the eye of the viewer, isn't it, whether peace projects can create similarly iconic images. But I think the idea of peace photography is asking us to really reassess what we think of as visually significant. And I feel that local image makers and participatory and community forms of image making from conflict-affected areas create and ask us to assess and perceive images and the significance of what these images are and what they're saying to us in a different way. They kind of push us, I guess, to see ordinary things in a new light in terms of we mustn't take them for granted. I think so many of us do when we haven't had to live directly with conflict and violence, and we take all these ordinary ingredients of peace totally for granted. So in that sense, a photography of peace can make visible all these elements of peace that we might not always consider.
Absolutely. No, that was a great answer, and that's super helpful. So the last question I like to ask everyone who comes on the podcast is, what does photography ethics mean to you?
I guess if I had to put it down to one thing, ethics for me is grounded in the relationships we make with other people. I always love the Ariella Azoulay quote about photography as a form of being with others. And so for me, that is very much where I understand ethics as lying, in terms of being grounded in our relationships with others, but also being accountable to the people that you work with and very transparent with the people you work with. So I think I've given you 3 different answers there, but essentially for me, ethics means accountability and transparency in how you deal with others and communicate your work. There's always the danger that the language of ethics end up obscuring what is actually happening. We can make it more complicated than it is. I worry a lot about people talking the talk about ethical photography, but we don't always walk the walk, and it's not simple to do that. But yeah, I would say that it's this idea of ethics being grounded really in transparent and accountable relationships with the people that we work with.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to share new insights about photography ethics with others. So if you heard something you liked, please share this podcast with someone who would appreciate it. You can also rate and review us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. This episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast is sponsored by Falmouth University, one of the UK's leading creative arts universities. In a world where images shape narratives, ethical photography has never been more important. At Falmouth University, the online photography MA helps you master your craft while exploring the responsibilities of visual storytelling. Learn from industry experts, challenge conventions, and develop work with integrity, all from almost anywhere in the world. Join a global community of photographers committed to making a difference. Search Falmouth online and book a call with a course advisor today. Join me next week when we hear from Tanya Habjuka on reevaluation and responsibility.